And welcome to the Talking Archive. My name is Josh Jacobs, and it's an honor to be speaking with the author of the recently released book, Frankly Speaking. He's a radio veteran, been in the New York as well as Miami and Dallas markets. Captain Frank Reed, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, Josh, it's my pleasure. And, Captain Frank, boy, those were the days. That goes back to the NBC era. So thanks for the memories. It's nice remembering those days.
Thank you. And, tell us about your life growing up and what influenced you to get into radio.
Well, I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and I grew up listening to a top 40 radio station called WLOF. It was an AM station, 950 on AM, and of course, this is back in the early 60s, mid 60s, when of course AM was still king. Mm-hmm. And they were the top 40 station in town with probably like a 40 share at night. Everybody listened to them. And I had a friend of mine that I went to high school with. And for the serious radio junkies listening to this, of course, there was a time when radio was very regulated, and there was such a thing as FCC operator licenses. And there was, if I remember right, there was 3 different categories of these licenses, and if you had a first-class FCC radio license, that would basically open the door for you for many radio stations, because if the radio station was a directional station, if it had more than one tower and they had a directional pattern, chances are that it needed to be operated by somebody who had a first-class operator's license. So there were these trade schools that popped up around the country where basically anybody could go in and for 5 weeks learn enough of the information to go into the FCC office and get a first-class license. Well, I had a friend of mine who did that, and in doing that, that opened up the door for him to be doing the overnight shift on the weekends at this giant top 40 radio station in Orlando, the station that everybody listened to. And I used to hang out with him on the weekends, and I'd go up there at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning or Sunday morning, and there would be girls calling him on the request line, and he just seemed to be having the time of his life. And I thought, well, this is wonderful. You can make money doing this. Well, I really struggled through high school. Really didn't have any plans. I was a terrible student. Didn't really have any college plans. Really didn't know what I wanted to do. So right out of high school, which was 68. Of course, you still had the Vietnam War going on, mm-hmm. and there were a lot of trade schools that popped up around the country that were taking advantage of these GIs coming home, and they would have the money paid for by the government to go to school, the GI Bill, and so there was a broadcasting school called Career Academy that I found out about, and they had a location in Atlanta, and I thought, well, if I could get into this school, maybe I could learn enough to get an entry job into radio. So I went to my parents and I said, hey, I think that I'd like to do what Mike does, my friend Mike. I said, I think maybe I'd like to be on the radio. Well, fortunately, they did have some money saved. And I think they probably thought, well, gee, he thinks he wants to do something. So anyway, my parents paid for the school in Atlanta, and I think I was there for 5 or 6 months, maybe a little bit longer. And I did learn how to run a board, and I did learn enough to get my third-class FCC license, and they taught you how to make a resume and make a demo tape. Well, I just went to all the stations around in Orlando. Well, I got a job at a little station in Kissimmee, Florida. This is pre-Disney. Mm-hmm. This is the summer of '69, and I am doing afternoons at WFIV in Kissimmee, Florida, the Mighty 5 at 1080, right smack dab in the middle of your radio dial.
Wow.
And I think I was making I was making maybe $2 an hour, and I remember I was.
They could get you admission to Disneyland at the time, at least.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I was also working at Burger Chef to help make ends meet, and flipping burgers. And anyway, I got it, and this was a traditional country music station that even played a hymn every hour.
Wow.
I was playing Tennessee Ernie Ford hymns, but I was playing a lot of Buck Owens and the Buckaroos and Merle Haggard and all of that stuff. So I stayed there, I think, for about 6 months, and then I got another job north of town in a town called Mount Dora, and that was a middle-of-the-road station. It was also a daytimer. And they ended up going out of business, and then a guy that was working part-time for us up there opened the door for me to go work at a pretty good country station in Orlando called WABR, which actually had some ratings. And I spent about a year and a half there. So I quickly found out in the business that if you wanted to get ahead, basically, if you're in a small market, you learn everything that you possibly can there and then try to move up to a bigger market. And I realized that the bigger the market, the more money I could make. Mm-hmm. So I stayed in Orlando at WABR, and then they went through an ownership change, and I finally got into Top 40 radio over in Cocoa Beach at WRKT. That was 1300 on AM. And then I went from there to WKIS in Orlando, which was owned by Susquehanna, which was a pretty big operation at the time. Worked with a wonderful guy who went on to have an incredible career in talk radio. His name was Gene Burns. Mm. And Gene passed away a few years ago, and he was at KGO in San Francisco, but he had worked at some monster radio stations. He'd been in Boston and WOR in New York. And
wow, and KGO for the longest time was the most listened to station in San Francisco overall.
No
only the
doubt
last 10 years.
Yeah, well, they went through an ownership change, and we won't get into that.
No, definitely not. But
yeah, and also, actually, KGO also, I stayed very good friends with Kevin Matheny, who was one of my program directors at WNBC, and he was actually brought into KGO to help turn it around. I forgot how many years ago, but Kevin, may he rest in peace, died of a heart attack on the job.
Oh no!
And yeah, he was a wonderful guy to work for. Anyway, so I moved from Cocoa Beach over to Orlando, and then I went over to Daytona. I was in Daytona for a couple of years at a few stations there, and then I got hired to go to Jacksonville. I remember when I went to Jacksonville, I thought, well, this is really the big time now because it's Jacksonville. And I was doing mornings at WIVY, which was one of the first FM stations in Jacksonville to play the hits. So that was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of success there. They also had an AM station, and when you combined the FM numbers with the AM numbers, we beat WAPE, which was the big 50,000 watt blowtorch at 690 on the dial, I think they were. And then from there, I had a guy who was a pretty good friend who was our production director, and he ended up leaving and going to WMYQ in Miami, which was one of the first stations in the early 70s to really play the hits on FM. And that was a tremendous ride being in Miami. We were in a ratings war with Y100, which was another top 40 station. And we flipped the call letters from WMYQ to WMJX, became 96X. And the guy that I worked for was one of the best program directors I've ever worked for in my life. His name was Jerry Clifton.
Wow.
And Jerry was crazy. Mm-hmm. He was wild, but from a creative standpoint, the radio station was just insanely wonderful. It was just a great radio station, and I was at a point in my life where I loved the business so much. I just sort of, all of us, that whole team, we just lived at the radio station and did radio, and that was pre-Christ, so it was big party atmosphere, and but the competition with Y100 was just it brought the best out of everybody, and
yeah,
Miami radio at that time was just wonderful. It was just creative and spectacular. And
what were some of the creative moves that Jerry Clifton did that made the station just pop?
Well, it's really funny. He was one of the things about Jerry is he really liked to counter program the competition. So he would do things like, when we launched 96X, I think we might have gone commercial free for a while, or we had a very, very low commercial load, and he would have promos where he would whisper and he would say, "Check around the dial. 96X plays less commercials," and we would do that right when Y100 was going into a giant long stop set. Things like that. I mean, we would show up in their parking lot with our van and give away $100 bills, and it was just we had a mascot called the Exegator. The Exegator would be at the Dolphin games and things like that. Mm-hmm. And the Exegator would show up at Y100 events and be escorted out, and it was great. It was crazy. It was wonderful. It was great. And, everything for us was, we had the X van. So if we find you Xing in your car, and then we find you Xing in your home, and are you Xing in your office, and everything was just XXX. It was just great fun. It was a wonderful season. And then, Jerry left, and, I worked with, runs radio and records? Joel.
Oh, yeah, Joel Whitburn?
No, Joel, oh, gosh. I'm having a brain. Everybody's freaking out now. They're going, Frank, not radio and records, All Access.
All Access. Oh, yeah. I'm blanking, too, on that.
Joel Denver came in.
Mm-hmm.
Joel Denver from All Access. Joel came in from WFIL in Philadelphia, and he was the new program director. Mm. And Joel was a great guy, but after I couldn't get in. I just couldn't get into it. And it wasn't anything against Joel. It's just after Jerry had been there and after Jerry had left, it just didn't. It wasn't. I just didn't have the same energy or the same determination, the same fun. And so I gave a long notice. I gave like a month notice, and then they said, "Well, can you stay a little longer?" And then I did. And anyway, I left, and I didn't have another job lined up. And I went to work with a guy in Sarasota and learned how to hang drywall in houses.
Oh wow!
And oh wow, that's right. And in the meantime, I didn't know where my next job was going to be, and Y100, and the guy's name was Bill Tanner, and he called and said, "Hey, come work for us." And Y100 was still, we came close to beating them, but I don't think we ever caught them. But Y100 was like a great station, and so they were offering me middays over there, and plus to be music director, and we met a couple of times, and it was, met management and all that, and the money was more than I was making. And I just had this gut feel to say no. Now, this is interesting because my life is devoid of anything spiritual at this time at all, but I just had this. There was something about crossing the street and competing against my friends that I had spent the last couple of years with, just living life with, and I just couldn't pull the trigger. It just didn't feel right to me. So that was monumental because Bob Pittman was rebuilding WNBC in New York, and they were going to fire everybody, and they were bringing in new people from all over the country. And so Bob knew Bill Tanner pretty well, and Bob called Bill and said, I have overnights left and part-time left up here. Do you know of anybody? And Tanner said, yeah, you need to call Frank Reed. I tried to hire him, but he's going to be snatched up by somebody. Said you should get him. So I get a call from Bob Pittman. I was actually visiting some friends in Melbourne at the beach.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was drinking beer, and he said, "Hey, this is Bob Pittman, WNBC New York. Would you be interested?" I said, "Sure." So they flew me up and interviewed and got the job and started out as the overnight guy,
mm-hmm.
and then got moved up to 10 to 2, and then got moved up to 6 to 10, and I'd been there about 6 months, and I got moved up to afternoon drive. And,
wow.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. It was a great experience, and then I've been doing afternoon drive, I guess, for about, I don't know, let me see. That was 82, 79, probably about 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I developed a drinking problem.
Mm.
And never affected my work at all. I always drank after work, but I would never start the day drinking or go in drunk or anything like that. But it definitely became a problem. And so I grew up in the church and sort of experienced the Jesus movement a little bit. Kind of ironic that Jesus Revolution movie is out. And I went to see it last night. It's absolutely wonderful. You got it. Everybody listening to this, you got to go see this movie. It's incredible.
Yeah, it stars Kelsey Grammer and who
yeah.
else is in it? One other star that's my name. The guy from The Chosen, Jonathan Rumi, who's the other star of the movie.
plays. I think his name is Larry Frisbee.
Frisbee, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. And but I must tell you, just a little sidebar: the Greg Laurie story and his wife Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
Their story and their love story is central to the film, and it is fantastic. I was thinking, I've had the opportunity to meet Greg and interview Greg,
mm-hmm.
and I'm watching this movie, and I'm thinking, man, what was he thinking the first time he saw this movie of his basically life being played out on the screen? And I don't know who the guy is that plays Greg and the young lady who plays his wife, but they just nail it. I mean, it's just incredible. So anyway, so I'm in New York, and so I start seeking and start praying a little bit, and I would even show up at a little church in Long Island because I had bought a pretty nice house in Long Island. And I'd show up at this church and sit in the back, and this is how crazy I was. I was so paranoid about anybody finding out who I was and what I was doing there,
mm-hmm.
that when they would pass the offering plate, I would write a check and put it in the offering.
Mm-hmm.
But I would white out my name and address so they wouldn't come visit me.
Oh,
it's that crazy. So anyway,
you couldn't accept that check probably today.
Yeah. So anyway, I start on this search, and I'm thinking, well, the Jesus movement thing and all that, and that was kind of fun. And I kind of think some of that was real, but here I'm doing afternoon drive in New York City. It's like, what? I'm going to come out and say that I believe in Jesus? That's crazy. I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll lose my job. People will think I'm nuts. And so I kept on having these psychosomatic problems, probably because I should have detoxed in the hospital, and I basically was dealing with it on my own and was on tranquilizers and this and that. And I kept on going back to the same doctor with, 1 week it would be a headache that didn't go away. Then it was chest pains that wouldn't go away. It was always something. So after about the third or fourth visit, this guy says, look, he says, I don't have any doubt that what you're feeling physically is real. He said, but every time you come in here, I check you out. You're totally fine. He said, I really think what's going on is going on up here. And he's pointing at my head.
Mm.
So I'm thinking, great, I'm fine. I'm just a nut job, right? So then he says, I have a psychologist. He's a friend of mine down the hall. Let me see if he's available. Let me get you in to see him. So 20 minutes later, I'm down the hall and I'm talking to this guy. He says, what's going on? How can I help you? And I said, I had a drinking problem and this and that. I just kept it very on the surface. I didn't give a lot of details.
Mm-hmm.
I talked for maybe 5 minutes. He said, listen, he said, I don't know what's going on with you. He said, but it sounds like that you're wrestling with making some kind of decision. He says, I don't know what it is you're wrestling with. He says, but whatever it is, he says, settle it. And then if you still have problems, call my office. I'll work you into my schedule.
We're talking with radio personality Frank Reed. And what happened next? What direction do you take? What decision do you make? We'll find out next time here on the Talking Archive.